Australia is the sixth biggest country on the planet, after Russia, Canada, China, the US, and Brazil. There are 195 countries in the world, so that's saying something. Its land area is 2,968,000 square miles. That's pretty huge. Here it is compared to China. China is 1.25 times bigger than Australia. Brazil is 1.11 times bigger than Australia. And the United States, excluding Alaska, is 1.05 times bigger than Australia. Overall, you could say these countries are about the same size. But then the gap becomes way more dramatic. Here's, for example, how Australia compares to Germany. And here it is next to the UK. Even Texas looks tiny next to Australia. By the way, if you remember, we recently talked about how massive Mongolia is, but even it can't compare to Australia. What am I getting at? Australia is actually a really huge country, and you don't usually think about it until you start comparing its size to other countries. But it gets even weirder when you look at the population numbers. Australia's population is 26.8 million. That's smaller than Texas, which has 30.5 million people, and it's nearly half the size of California's population, which is 38.9 million. By the way, here's how Australia and California look when you compare their sizes. Tiny Britain has way more people than Australia, about 69.3 million. Even Madagascar beats Australia in population with 32.2 million. And that's not counting the penguins. Some cities have more people than all of Australia. Take Delhi, for instance. It has 34.6 million people, and Shanghai has a whopping 40.8 million. So the current population density of Australia in 2024 is 3.45 people per half a square mile. Well, looks like it's time to figure out why almost no one lives on the huge land of Australia. I'll just make myself some coffee first. Just an unobtrusive reminder to hit the like button if you forget. And thanks. You know what for. To get a better grasp of things, it's a good idea to start by understanding how life works in Australia. It's actually one of the most urbanized countries in the world. 90% of the population lives on only 0.22% of the country's territory, and 87% of people live within 30 miles of the coast. The 2016 census shows that over two-thirds of Australians live in the capital, and 40% of the population resides in the two biggest cities, Sydney and Melbourne. In this huge country, there are actually only 5 major cities. I already mentioned Sydney and Melbourne, then there's Brisbane and Perth, and Adelaide comes in 5th. And it's the last city with more than 1 million people. After that, there's Canberra, the capital, with just 466,000 people, Hobart with 253,000, and that's it. The rest of the cities have even fewer people. The vast majority of towns and villages in Australia are small. Almost 2,300 of them have a population of 5,000 people or even fewer. You can get a good sense of Australia's population from this map. The gray areas show where no one lives, while the orange and red highlight the most densely populated spots. Only in Australia can you see situations where one police officer monitors an area the size of the UK, because most of the land is a scorched desert. This happened in Birdsville, almost right in the middle of the continent. Another great example of emptiness is the Shire of East Pilbara, a local government area in the Pilbara region of Western Australia. It's bigger than the Australian states of Victoria and Tasmania combined, but only 9,760 people live there. And it's like this all over Australia. You can just pick random areas in the central part of the country, check their population, and you'll see that the numbers are really tiny. All because 0.9% of Australia's population lives in the red zone, 243,000 people. Now look here. This is a typical map that Griffith Taylor, a fairly well-known Australian geographer and anthropologist, created in the 1920s to counter arguments for a huge population size on the Australian continent. Griffith's goal was to explain his point of view to the public. He believed that by the 1920s, the limits of Australian settlement had essentially been reached. Expanding further across the continent was so difficult that it was basically pointless. The map shows that the population distribution in Australia is closely linked to the distribution of good farmland and grazing land. In a sense, not much has changed on the continent by the beginning of the 21st century. Back in the 1920s, about a quarter of Australia was marked as useless land, because people back then didn't exactly mind their language. But if you take a look at the map of annual rainfall in Australia, you'll notice that it looks almost exactly like the map of Australia's population. They're nearly identical. People settle where there's some moisture, and that's totally understandable. 70% of the mainland of Australia is classified as semi-arid, arid, or desert land, making Australia the driest inhabited continent on Earth. The only place drier is Antarctica. But living there's a bit of a challenge. The main reason for the formation of Australia's deserts is their location. Like most large deserts around the world, they're situated at a specific latitude, about 30 degrees north or south of the equator, where the weather itself creates a dry climate. Australia's deserts cover about 529,000 square miles, or 18% of the continent, but around 35% of the Australian land gets so little rainfall that these areas could almost be considered deserts as well. It's no wonder Australia is called the driest inhabited continent with the least fertile soils. The soils here are not just infertile, they're also very old. The levels of nitrogen and phosphorus in them are, on average, about half as much as in other dry regions around the world. The continent is very, very old. Australia shifted from its original position, attached to Gondwana, to the subtropical zone, where rainfall is less frequent and more unpredictable. This drift began about 20 million years ago. And then the continent started drying out, with tropical forests retreating to the eastern coast. Scientists love to say that Australia has a long history of drought. Even the deserts here are special. The word desert itself might bring to mind images of vast sand dunes with no trees in sight like in the Sahara, but that's Africa, not Australia. People who see the Australian desert for the first time are surprised because most of the area is actually made up of shrubs, grasslands, or even forests. It's called a desert because European settlers couldn't figure out how to use it for anything, like farming. For the same reason, old maps refer to the land as useless. But it also goes by the official name Outback. The Outback is the expansive, nearly uninhabited, dry inland areas of Australia. Still, this wilderness isn't just dry and barren. It runs from the north to the south coast of Australia and includes several different climate zones. You've got tropical and monsoon climates in the north, dry regions in the red center, and semi-arid and temperate climates further south on the continent. The shortage of industrial land use caused the Outback to be recognized globally as one of the biggest untouched natural areas on Earth. Still, there are people there. Some of them are pastoralists. Cattle, sheep, and occasionally goats graze in mostly untouched natural ecosystems. But of course, the main economic activity in this area is mining. Because of the almost complete absence of mountain formation and glaciation since the Permian period, and in many areas even since the Cambrian, the Outback is literally full of iron, aluminum, manganese, and uranium ores. There are also deposits of gold, nickel, copper, lead, and zinc. And don't forget that the Argyle Diamond Mine is in Western Australia, and it used to be the biggest producer of natural diamonds in the world, providing around a third of global reserves. Well, oil, it's found here too. The oil and gas industry in the Pilbara is the region's biggest export sector. But if European settlers couldn't adapt to the conditions of the Outback, what about the indigenous people? Well, it turns out they managed just fine. Indigenous Australians lived in the desert for at least 50,000 years and occupied all regions, including the driest ones. Tribes and clans of the natives roamed the desert regions for thousands of years. They survived off local plants and animals, and they definitely didn't consider this land useless. The local tribes were so used to these conditions that some of them didn't come into contact with outsiders until the middle of the 20th century. They just lived in the center of the continent and successfully avoided any contact. If you check the map of where the native people are in Australia, you'll find that they live in places with the smallest population. See for yourself. As of June 30th, 2021, there were 984,000 Indigenous people living in Australia, which is 3.8% of the total population. Indigenous peoples tend to live in urban and regional areas more often, but about 15% of them, or 150,900 people, live in remote and very remote areas. One of the reasons for this type of settlement was the lack of forced relocation. Natives living in areas of intensive farming and coastal zones were often forced to move. Yes, the colonization of the continent by Europeans played a big role in why Central Australia ended up almost empty. When the first fleet arrived in January 1788, the new settlers found themselves in a country with a completely different climate than the one they'd left behind. Their tools, farming methods, crops, and livestock weren't suited to the harsh, relatively barren land around Port Jackson Bay. People wanted to cultivate the land and grow food, but their lack of experience in farming methods and the unfamiliar landscape led them to the brink of starvation. They had to look for more suitable places to finally get a decent harvest and just stay alive. In the end, farming was practiced in southern and eastern Australia. In the dry and tropical parts of the continent, settlers decided to focus on cattle farming, build ranches, all that kind of stuff. At the same time, they were pushing the indigenous people deeper into the country, taking over land that seemed suitable for living to the colonizers. This displacement of the indigenous peoples continued until the 1970s. Basically, Europeans just took the easiest part of Australia and decided they didn't need to go any further. They called this land useless, and that was that. The settlers were sure that the indigenous people had no clue about farming, but they were wrong. Recently, there's more and more evidence that Australian Aborigines did practice farming. It just looked very different from European farming. It was simply misunderstood, and many of these agricultural practices were lost over time. Maybe if that hadn't happened, the center of the country might have been settled after all. Because one of the reasons it's so empty is agriculture. Today, Australia is a major producer and exporter of agricultural products, with over 325,300 people working in farming, forestry, and all types of fishing. Farmers and ranchers own 135,997 farms, covering 61% of the country's land. The area of arable land in Australia in 2021 was 77 million acres. That's about the size of the whole country of Poland. A whole Poland in Australia is used for growing wheat, sugarcane, grapes, and tons of other crops. It's no surprise that Australia is one of the top 7 countries in terms of land use. By the way, India ranks first on that list. So farmers and farm managers remain the most common professional category working in agriculture. They make up 56% of all people working in this sector. In general, agriculture is really important for Australia. There's simply no reason for people to move deeper into the country. Why would they? What's there to do when there are few cities, few people, and basically no real conditions for agriculture? The lack of land for fields isn't really a big issue. Wherever you can't plant anything, you can graze cattle. But there's another problem that makes people unlikely to settle in the inland areas of Australia. This map shows the reason very well. It shows all the permanent and seasonal rivers of Australia. And yes, there are none in the inland areas, except for the southeast. Although there are over 1 million rivers in Australia, more than 70% of them are dry and flow only part of the year. Sometimes they're not even considered rivers and aren't included in the overall statistics. Australia relies a lot on groundwater right now, but like in many parts of the world, underground reserves are being overused. That's why modern-day Australia is a country on the brink of a water crisis. The average annual rainfall is about 18.5 inches a year, which is much lower than the global average, and on top of that, climate change predictions aren't looking good at all. It's possible that even this amount of rain might become a thing of the past. Over the next few decades, it could drop by half. The extreme dryness of Australia is caused not only by global warming. In fact, it's a combination of unique factors that played a part. Look, the West Coast is dominated by cold ocean currents, which means that evaporation to form rain clouds is minimal. At the same time, the Great Dividing Range, a mountain range running along the east coast of Australia, prevents rain from reaching deep into the country. There aren't many mountains here to push the air upwards where it can cool down and turn into rain. And the region's dominated by a subtropical high-pressure zone. It both heats and dries the air. The continent's also highly susceptible to El Niño, the southern oscillation, which heats up or cools down the Pacific Ocean and can bring long periods of high temperatures and drought. Overall, it's all due to the continent's location and landscape. At the same time, agriculture remains the largest consumer of water in Australia. Nearly 70% of the water goes to it. Over the past decade, Australia's been going through especially harsh droughts. So harsh, in fact, that in many places they have to impose forced water use restrictions. And these restrictions obviously hit agriculture the hardest. Farmers are leaving their fields empty and selling off herds. Tourist numbers are going down, and parks and gardens are turning brown from the lack of water. This is something you could see in the town of Dubbo, New South Wales, or in Warwick, Queensland. Both of these cities are located in Australia's favorable area with a large population. Even if people here face a water shortage, no one will try to deliver it deep into the heart of the continent, so no farms in the middle of the desert. Australia will remain uninhabited. Mega droughts are coming. And as if Australia didn't already have enough problems with deserts and droughts, the country's facing a new challenge. A study from the Australian National University warns of the possibility of megadroughts, which could last more than 20 years due to global warming. The university notes that such droughts have already occurred in Australia in the past millennium, repeating every 150 to 1,000 years, depending on the forecasting model. Since the early 20th century, when Australia began officially recording rainfall, 4 major droughts have already been recorded on the continent, but it seems the country's facing something even more serious. What should Australians do with this information? Well, at the very least, prepare for trouble. In general, the main measure to soften these megadroughts is said to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But as long as human activity continues, people driving to work in their cars or using air conditioners, nothing will change. Experts also emphasize the need for Australia to take strong action in managing water resources. But how can they manage them even more effectively when some parts of the country are already struggling with water shortages? Besides, agriculture will be at risk if water consumption is seriously limited. Plus, during droughts, there will be a need to support rural areas and the environment so that many animals don't die off and all that. In short, what exactly to do about these megadroughts isn't really clear yet. Disappearing lake. Lake George in New South Wales, only about a 30-minute drive from Canberra, is worrying scientists and baffling tourists. The thing is, depending on the season or even the month, the lake can be either full or almost totally dry. Do you think it's just a harmless natural quirk? Nope. The lake is in danger of disappearing forever, and it could happen pretty soon. This lake is unique in a way. Nothing flows in or out of it. The water level rises only from rainfall, and it loses water through evaporation and underground seepage. When the lake dries up, scientists get the chance to go down to its bottom to collect samples, which helps them study the history of this natural site more closely. Usually, the water comes back, but with the megadroughts I just mentioned, the lake might eventually dry up, especially if the drought lasts around 20 years and the lake itself is shallow, only 25 feet deep. By the way, in 1901, Lake George was even considered as a potential location for Australia's capital, but the idea failed, once again because of a drought that happened the following year. Rewilding the desert. Ever heard of rewilding? It's a concept that involves restoring wild nature, planting trees, and doing everything else that benefits the environment. Well, Australia plans to restore its deserts using this method. And no, it's not to spread the population across a new fertile area or build farms there. Everything is being done just for the animals. For now. The deserts of Australia have always been full of life, which adapted to harsh conditions, but the local fauna wasn't ready to face invasive predators. Animals simply had nowhere to hide. On top of that, wildfires pose a serious threat. All of this leads to the extinction of many native species. If you look at deserts from a different perspective, Australia, despite its small population, is one of the countries with the highest rates of deforestation among developed nations. In the last 2 centuries, almost 50% of the country's forests have been destroyed, leading to the loss of many rare woodlands and grasslands and turning them into barren land. To fix the situation, Australia has set itself the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% from 2005 levels by 2030. One of the key steps in this process is greening desert areas. Planting trees and other vegetation helps absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which helps reduce the number of greenhouse gases causing global warming. Additionally, local plant species that thrive in the country's desert regions are perfectly adapted to harsh climate conditions. For example, they have deep root systems that reach groundwater, and they can store moisture in their leaves and stems. Overall, that sounds like a good plan. Underground homes. As I've already said, people do live in the central part of Australia, and there's a place with only about 100 people, and they go about their everyday lives underground. All of this happens about a 12-hour drive west of Sydney in the remote town of White Cliffs, famous for its opal mines. So what's the deal here? It's all about extreme temperatures and climate change. People moved underground as early as the mid-20th century because staying on the surface was simply impossible. In 1973, they recorded a record high of 119.5 degrees Fahrenheit, but temperatures above 104 degrees Fahrenheit are pretty normal for this region. Recently, White Cliffs set a new national record for the hottest night, with the temperature staying at 93.6 degrees Fahrenheit. When it comes to living underground, the temperature is quite comfortable, around 72 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. But don't think people live in primitive caves. The townsfolk arrange their homes with all sorts of comforts, and some even decorate them with various art objects. Proper ventilation is also important, as without it, mold will appear. To let in sunlight, they use windows and light wells. These underground homes are built from recycled materials. If there was more greenery around, I'd compare the White Cliffs to the Shire. But unfortunately, no. Let's leave the Shire to New Zealand. Ghost towns. Once a bustling shopping street in Leichhardt, known as Little Italy, has now turned into a nearly deserted place. Cafes and small businesses are barely hanging on, and many storefronts are now empty. Why? Because people simply have nowhere to live. Between 2001 and 2016, almost no new affordable housing was built in Sydney, and for a business to thrive, it's important to have customers within walking distance. New housing brings in new residents, including young people and potential small business owners. And when there's no place to live, there's no one to sell goods and services to, so many shops and businesses just close down. The government's all for preserving Australia's heritage. In other words, they want to leave everything as it is. In Sydney, there's even a ban on building terraces, two-story buildings, and townhouses. But the population's growing. People need somewhere to work, do business, buy stuff. How can all this happen in a place where you can't afford housing? No idea. Maybe they'll have to build homes underground. You owe me a like. See you later.